So excellent as you are all coming in. Thank you very much for coming to our session on Oracy in RE. Do we need to talk more? I'm going to do some introductions now. And whilst I'm doing that, and as more people are coming in, I wonder if you want to pop into the chat why you are here. That's not supposed to be an existential question. That is supposed to be why you are very specifically choosing to come along to a webinar that is on Oracy and RE. Do we need to talk more right now? So why are you here? Or what is it you are interested in about Oracy, and specifically about Oracy in RE? So please do add those thoughts to the chat. You might want to say who you are as well. And as we've got all of those things coming into the chat, I will do some introductions. The event, as you've probably noted, is being recorded, and we are going to subtitle that, and then we'll pop it onto our homepage in our Oracy Week tile. So that'll be there in about a week, 10 days. Do share that with other people who haven't been able to come along. If you're just coming in, we're asking you to pop into the chat why you are here, what you're interested in about Oracy and RE. I hope you've seen some of the content that we've had this week already. We've had 3 excellent blogs from Rachel, who is one of our speakers today. She started us off at the weekend looking at the importance of, and I love this, Rachel, being even more human with a more human curriculum in our new artificial era. She talks about the importance in that blog of understanding and the power of Oracy around that. We also heard from Julie Childs. I've seen her in the room. Oh, I can even see her face in front of me, who until very recently was an excellent reception and Key Stage 1 teacher. And she talked about some brilliant strategies she used with her pupils. And Kelly Keatley as well, who is one of our people on our leadership program in year 1. She's a secondary teacher, and she's talked about empowering pupils to find and use their voice in RE, and her journey about embedding critical oracy into her classroom and into her curriculum. We've got a couple more blogs to come as well. And worth waiting for, we've got Will Ord as one of our speakers here. He's providing us with a resource spotlight that's going to come up tomorrow, the Good Reasoning Tree. I think he's going to mention it this afternoon. And on either Friday or Saturday, Beth, who I can also see in our room today, we're going to have the benefit of her excellent research she did on her master's around debate in her Key Stage 4 classroom. So we're looking forward to all of those things. So let's start off by introducing our speakers then. I've mentioned a couple of them already. So we have with us today Rachel Higginson. Rachel and I had a great chat about Oracy a few weeks ago. Well, I thought it was great anyway, about Oracy a few weeks ago. She's an education thinker. She's a curriculum specialist. She's the Oracy Strand expert lead for the Chartered College on their Rethinking Curriculum project. She works with Mary Myatt. I'm sure you all know Mary Myatt, Myatt & Co. And she's also the founder of something called Finding My Voice. She will talk more about that. And to my great joy, as no surprise to anyone who knows me, she used to be a primary school teacher. I do love secondary school teachers too, which is why we have Azaan here. Azaan Akbar is on year 2 of the Culham St Gabriel's Leadership Scholarship Programme, and he is a secondary school teacher. As well as that, he is Newham School Council Lead and an education consultant. So we're really pleased to have you here as well, Azaan. We've also got Ryan, Dr. I shall use your formal name as it's very new to you, Ryan. Ryan is Dr. Ryan Parker as of about 3 or 4 months ago from my memory, and he's a Diocesan RE advisor following being a teacher for a number of years in primary and middle school settings. And as I said, he recently completed that PhD at the University of Birmingham, and he was looking at knowledge-rich textual inquiry in primary RE. He also has his own podcast, which is called Flourishing Together. And Rachel is to be seen on many a podcast too. I've seen her on podcasts, but Ryan's got his own there. And finally, we've got Will Ord. Will was a head of RE before he became in secondary schools, before he became an education consultant. He's particularly specialised in philosophy for children. For over 30 years, Will, you don't look old enough, obviously. He was chair of Sapere, which is the philosophy for children kind of overseeing society. The charity for philosophy for children in the UK. He's trained thousands of teachers. He'd make us very jealous if we said where he'd been to train them, because it's not all in this country. And he's particularly been working on the art of argument to help young people develop argument as a specific life learning and citizenship skill. So, for great people to listen to, how this session is going to work is we're going to hear from our speakers in turn. And if we've got time, then they will ask a question to one another, or we may just go straight to the floor. So feel free. It's been lovely to see those things. I shall have a read of them as to why you're here in a moment. But you might have comments you want to add along. If you have a question you want me to ask of our speakers at the end, do pop the word question in front of it, and that will help me notice it out of all the chat. Each speaker is going to have up to about 8 minutes. So we're going to get started. The Oracy Commission, that I'm sure you all know, came out about 5-6 months ago now, agreed that Oracy can be best defined as articulating ideas, developing understanding, and engaging with others through speaking, listening, and communication. They also talked about disciplinary oracy, being different in different subjects. So there's our context. We're going to start off with Rachel. So Rachel, thank you very much for coming along. What would you say? We heard what the Oracy Commission said, but what would you say Oracy is, and how do you think it might be important in RE?
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you for giving me the honour of starting our conversation this evening. I must say it's a dubious honour, but I'm going to do my very best. I am in a hotel room, so if my signal goes, Fiona will shout at me and I will switch to my hotspot. It's an absolute privilege to have so many people join. I assume a lot of people are joining at the end of their working day, which I think is incredible. Thank you. So what is Oracy? It's a contentious question, actually, because the term oracy was coined way back in 1965, and I actually interviewed Ros Wilson for a podcast recently, who you may know. She's just written a beautiful book on oracy, and she was part of the original Oracy project, which was just fascinating, listening to how the Oracy journey began. And it actually was termed Oracy to bring speaking, the act of speaking, in line with literacy and numeracy. I think that has some value for us to consider the provenance of Oracy and where this has come from. But I think where we really need to sit right now is where is the world now? And what does Oracy need to be within our curriculums today? So if I could just zoom out a moment, I think what we need to really consider, as you may have read in my blog, don't worry if you haven't read it, and that's no reason to read it, but I think that we need to understand that we are now firmly in a very challenging time in our society. And it's important to understand two things. One, for the first time ever, we have a being more intelligent than us on the planet. And two, this being is evolving without us, and we've no idea where that's going to head. We also know that our young people are more connected than ever before. We also know that that is a good thing and a really difficult thing as well. We know that social media has sent us to be more polarized. We are now firmly in the world of misinformation. It's very hard to tell when something's true and when it's not. Klaus Schwab, who wrote a beautiful book in 2016 on the fourth industrial revolution, said that either this is the golden age, which of course we hope and pray it is, or this is the beginning of the end. And we're not going to labour on the latter, but what we do need to understand is this key point. What he said is to really thrive within this new era, we need to up our humanness. We need to maximise the potential that this new era brings in the way in which AI can do lots of wonderful things in the world. But we also need to be its complementary partner. We need to be powerfully human. So in terms of how we interpret Oracy today, I think it needs to be the absolute heart of a human curriculum, a curriculum that is intentionally built to shape humans ready to thrive in the world. Andy Clark from the University of Birmingham, philosopher, said that we have become brain-bound in education. And I firmly sit in a camp that says, in some respects, we have. Annie Murphy-Paul took this concept of being brain-bound, and she did a big study of lots of different areas of cognitive science. Some she looked into current studies, but she also did some studies of her own. And what she found was the way in which we interpret learning in education is that it happens inside our heads, when in actual fact, we learn in our whole selves. We learn in the world, we learn in our environment, and we learn with each other. We learn through dialogue. And so therein, Oracy. Now, I started a project about 7 years ago called Finding My Voice, helping young people at risk of exclusion to re-engage in education. And whilst doing that work, the idea was that we would help them both physically become more competent and confident in expressing themselves, but also metaphorically grow a greater sense of who they are in the world. And through doing that work, what I discovered was, yes, we can learn to talk, and yes, we can learn through talk, which is the beautiful work from the Oracy Cambridge and Voice 21. But actually, we also really help young people to grow their sense of self through this. So within Finding My Voice, what we have designed is a complementary model to the Oracy framework, which is all about developing an authentic Oracy approach. So that is really tapping into what are the human benefits of having an Oracy rich education. First and foremost, growing a sense of my authentic voice, then how I take that into collaborating and listening to my peers, then going to a deeper place. And this is the magical place we get to in RE. And I know that RE is a place that I experienced it probably more than any other subject, where young people are into thinking. This is what Neil Mercer calls, it's about thinking together and holding the space. It's no longer solitary thoughts, it's us all holding a space of thought together. And I think for me, that's where I want our young people to get to, that deep dialogic place where we're thinking as a collective. I also think that quite often we translate Oracy into a space of debate. And I really think for the modern world, what we need to do is get to a place of common understandings as well, whereas quite often any group dynamics are placed in a debate space, whereas actually what we need to be aiming for is for a deeper understanding of each other. So how do we do this? Within Finding My Voice, what we talk about is lots of different elements to Oracy happening in the classroom, not just a set of tools. So we first think about a whole school culture. What is the culture of children feeling belonging and feeling safe, and what is unique and beautiful about that community? And then thinking about the beauty of different disciplines. So within Finding My Voice, we try to help our subject specialists to really tap into what is the unique beauty of your subject, the core purpose of it, and therefore what environment do you create and curate for the young people to really be able to engage in deep Oracy. So then thinking about capturing the heart of that subject, thinking about how you create a curriculum that really upholds talk. I think there's two elements to this. You've got the rituals of talk, so things that you regularly do that young people can adapt to, things like think, pair, share, Harkness techniques. There's all sorts of different elements that you can use, but also there needs to be a rigor. So thinking about how you build and grow vocabulary, so you're really being ambitious about what you want your young people to think about. One important thing to note on that is that quite often we see talk as a physical act, and actually what talk is us expressing our thoughts. So really thinking about how we map those thoughts and those concepts that come through talk are really, really important. The next thing we talk about a lot is beautiful resources. Talk doesn't thrive from a PowerPoint slide. Talk thrives from a rich, vibrant, enhancing space. It thrives from great experiences, great visitors, physical artifacts. And then most importantly, and I think this is the bit that sometimes we miss, is if I can have a beautiful resource and an incredible question, then I get to a place of deep oracy. So that enables us to go really deep and to really allow our subjects to thrive within the space. And actually, thank you. This is my last point, Fiona. Oh, I've been very good with my time. I have a great memory of sitting, and so I set up a ritual of big questions at the end of RE in year 1. And we got to a very deep dialogic space, and I extended that time over weeks and weeks because it became our favourite part of the week. And I can still remember the spine-tingling conversations I had even with that age. So yeah, that's my 8 minutes.
Rachel, thank you so much for that. You have just reminded me of my time in the primary classroom. I used to have a big question time in my year groups. I particularly remember it in year 5 because it used to be just before mental maths, which was just before lunch, and the amount of time we never got to mental maths, which I think was entirely their aim as well. They were a feisty bunch in the centre of Leicester, and they were quite right. You know, it was far more interesting to look at those big questions. So thank you so much to think about there. I think nobody said anything in the chat. You should probably see that as a real positive. That's because they were all absolutely hanging on every word, or at least I was. I've already filled the piece of paper that I'd got. So thank you so much, Rachel. Azaan, I'm so sorry I put you to follow Rachel, but I did. So Azaan, we are going to ask you. So Azaan, you'll remember teachers in secondary. Azaan, do you agree with what Rachel's just said, her understanding of oracy? Anything else you want to add from your own perspective? And what does oracy look like in your RE classroom? And why do you think it is important as part of RE? Over to you, Azaan.
Thanks, Fiona. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And yeah, I'll do my best following on from Rachel after what was, brilliant to hear from on so many of those different points. Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, no, I think starting on, whether or not there are, things like, there are lots of things that I think Rachel brought up that are really interesting. I think one particular point I'd love to highlight again is that point around the kind of idea of learning in our whole sense, and how using talk for learning is, and using oracy in our classrooms isn't just about getting them to say some interesting points, but rather, that engagement. If you can say it, if you can feel it, then you're more likely to be able to do things like translating it into writing. So that's a particular area that I'm really interested in terms of how we use oracy to be able to then apply that to things like our writing. Because obviously, we have the challenges of things like, the big O word Ofsted and exams and whatnot. So those sorts of challenges can mean that there's always a question about how are you making sure that you're evidencing things like, progress in your lesson when you're using these oracy activities, and how is it done in an effective way. So that's particularly some things that I would love to talk about as well. And I also think, this idea of I suppose whether or not I I wouldn't say agree or disagree, but rather I would love to develop on Rachel's point around dialogue versus debate. And I think this is something that is a discussion that is ongoing in Oracy at the moment about how do we move. Is debate, for example, itself a good approach to Oracy? Or is it something that something else that we should be kind of aiming for? Just to give a bit more into my background, in addition to being a secondary school teacher, I've done lots of debate coaching and debating competitively. And at the moment now, I run a debate club in my own school, and do lots of debate coaching and debate competition leading. So I come from a background of lots of competitive debating, and that has certainly coloured the way that I think about Oracy. But it's also been interesting being able to bring in other perspectives on how good Oracy looks like, not just in a sense where it's done in a competitive manner, and how that can be done in an effective way. So I think I want to start on this point about dialogue versus debate, and why I think, for example, from my perspective, debate can often be a really interesting and useful way of getting into the approach for Oracy. And for me, I was having this discussion with Will actually quite a couple of weeks ago, and one of the ways that I like to think about it is that often when we bring children into a discussion about a topic, it can be very difficult for students to think beyond a binary, because there's so much about the way that our education works that means that there's always a kind of yes or no, or an agree or disagree, or right or wrong. And so because young people are taught to think in binaries so often, it can be very difficult to then push them into a mode where they have to now think beyond the binary and think of it as dialogue and expression and engagement and unification and all those sorts of ways. It's something that we definitely need to aim for. And I think that is probably the end point, or not even the end point, but that is the progression, the natural progression of good Oracy. And I think for me, I always think that debate is a good way to start the discussion and start practicing Oracy, so that they can then reach the ability to engage in effective dialogue, dialogue that allows them to engage with each other, to think as a collective, as Rachel was saying. And so I've found that in my experience, when I've introduced Oracy activities through the framing of debates, that has been very exciting for pupils. They've found it really interesting, because they have an awareness of that. I know what it means to have a particular side, and it's an unfortunate reality. I think, given the way that the world is, again, as Rachel was mentioning, it means that they have this keen sense of what it means to be entrenched in a particular side. So what we can then do as educators is use those skills to say, okay, rather than entrenching yourself, why don't we use it to empathize with a viewpoint that's not your own? So, for example, when I run activities in my classroom, I will often get them to originally think what their opinion is, but then I might get them to speak about an opinion that is not theirs, or a point of view that's not theirs. So I did this a little while ago at the NatTre conference, where we did an activity called Where Do You Stand? And on the kind of final statement that I get students to do, I say, okay, stand on the side that you agree with, and they go and stand on a side that they agree with, and they agree or disagree with a particular statement. And then I say, I've swapped the walls. So now people who are on the agree side are now disagree, people on the disagree side are now agree. And it's a really great moment, because students start scrambling and they want to start running off to the other direction, because there's safety in your own opinions. But suddenly I'm challenging them to empathize and think, okay, well, how would I now argue this from the perspective of somebody who doesn't agree with me? So for me, I think entering the discussion, or entering Oracy-based activities from that sense of the binary of the agree versus the disagree, the right versus wrong, the this opinion versus that opinion, it allows students to start to see, okay, maybe the binary aren't as entrenched as maybe I've thought they were. And that can, for me, be an effective way of going about that. And actually today, we literally just as I've left last period, I was observing a student teacher who was delivering a lesson that I designed. He's actually in the call today, so I hope you don't mind me calling you out his name. But he took on my lesson that I designed for this unit on diversity in the Global Ummah is the name of the unit, and we're exploring what does diversity look within the religion of Islam. And the first lesson today was kind of focused on diversity and faith in general. And I had an activity where I basically had 3 statements, somewhat controversial. And the other context is that my school is a girls' school and about 98% Muslim. There are students from other backgrounds, faith backgrounds as well, but the overwhelming majority are Muslim girls. So what that meant was I then put some statements, and the activity basically was that they had a statement and they had to find someone in the classroom who agreed with it, someone who disagreed with it, and they then had to explain why on each of those sides. And they walked around the classroom, talking to each other and finding people who agreed or disagreed with the statements. And I purposefully chose statements that I know are the kind that not all of them will agree on. So, for example, the first statement was something like, the main role of women is to look after the family. Interesting, controversial topic, and one that you might think, and again, depending on the context that you're in, will throw up different answers. The second one was music is haram, which is a very controversial topic that's discussed. Sorry, was that 1 minute, Fiona?
Was.
I have no sense of time. And then the final one was wearing the hijab makes you a better Muslim. And what was amazing to see was even this trainee teacher who had taken on this lesson was able to get such a testament to his ability, but also to the class in their ability to just really get into that discussion. And they were really engaged with the lesson, every single one of them, and it's ordinarily quite a chatty class, but every single one of them was really engaged with the lesson. They were arguing with each other. They were saying, I understand why you say that, however, I think this. Some were changing their opinions because they learnt new information from each other. And it kind of fostered this sense of like an Enlightenment era parlor, I call it, where they're really engaging in that dialogue. But for me, it started with setting out these false binaries and then allowing them to develop into the dialogue. So that has been kind of my approach to teaching this sort of work in Oracy, but I'm very happy to expand on it more in the question section.
Thank you so much, Azaan. It was really interesting listening to that, having thought about what Rachel said. And I was in your session at Strictly and it was great. That move that you say from debate to dialogue that you see within secondary, I was thinking with my primary head on and wonder if it's slightly different with younger pupils. But we've got Ryan for that. So thanks very much, Azaan. And I'm glad you're bringing along people to the session. Very good. So Ryan, I want to ask you to join our conversation now. So we've heard from both Azaan and Rachel. Do you agree with what they've said? What have you got to add? But particularly talk about what you find and what Oracy looks like in the primary RE classroom. Is it different to, as I perhaps suggested? And why might that be important as part of RE? Ryan, over to you.
Thank you so much, Fiona, and it's so lovely to join you all. Thank you so much for attending. I mean, certainly I really resonate with the previous descriptions of Oracy from Rachel and Azaan. I mean, I love that Enlightenment parlour and that human connection, that human curriculum. For me, in my own role, I often speak about the aim of RE in enabling pupils to develop their religious literacy, to be able to hold balanced and well-informed conversations about religion and belief. And for me, equipping pupils to have such conversations, it's so important. It enables pupils to connect and collaborate with others, to express themselves, to understand others, to test out ideas and to explore them. Strong Oracy skills enable pupils to articulate their thoughts, their opinions, their understandings to others in a clear and compelling manner. And I think it's wonderful when you can see pupils take such confidence and take such joy in doing so, in sharing their thoughts and their very selves with the world. I think for me as well, conversational classrooms enable pupils to know and to feel that they have a voice. Pupils aren't passive vessels to be filled with adult knowledge, but wonderful individuals who come to the classroom with something to say, with opinions, with their very selves, with their questions, their curiosities. And linking to what Rachel said, conversational classrooms allow pupils to deepen their very sense of their identity as active agents in the world. And of course, this has a civic importance, promoting healthy civic engagement. How can we help pupils to develop the skills to listen actively and critically, to invite other views, to ensure that all have been and feel heard, to ask questions, to speak to influence or persuade, and of course to disagree well. Too often I fear that speaking has been perceived as the poor relation to reading and writing in the primary school. And perhaps this is due to a perception that good speaking is caught rather than taught. And perhaps I know I've been there. I know all too well the concern for getting written evidence in books, which creates some hesitancy in employing strategies in which there is not a physical record to show for it. Key, I think, in thinking about oracy, certainly in thinking in RE, in helping pupils to have balanced, well-informed conversations about religion and belief, is to think about the types of knowledge and the knowledge itself that pupils will explore in RE. I think oracy is best when it's calibrated to be subject specific and supports the aims of the subject under exploration. And in that light, I'm really heartened by the move to worldviews in religious education. I know when I started in the teaching profession many moons ago, there was a textbook at the back of my cupboard, and if I used it, it would have been dead easy to teach. It presented this imagined landscape in which all Christians looked like this, believed this, did this, worshipped in this particular 12th century church, etc. And of course, that would have presented pupils with an inaccurate, misleading, and narrow understanding. But how can we help in RE pupils to understand and encounter the actual landscape of religion and belief in all its beautiful messiness, and help pupils to really grapple with aspects both deep and profound? And so I'm quite taken with the notion of dialogic learning in RE. And how I define dialogic learning comes from Philipson and Werduref, and they define it as what are we inviting pupils to reason across and through. And of course, enabling and supporting pupils to speak well with and listen to others in a shared inquiry helps pupils, I think, in their reasoning across and through the beautifully complex landscape of religion and belief. And in my own research, which Fiona mentioned, I was particularly interested in sacred text inquiry in the primary school. I noted a lot of plans which were too narrow. There essentially were a game of guess what single meaning is on the curriculum plan. And, you know, it may have invited pupils to share their views, perhaps in a circle or otherwise. And it was essentially a little bit like, thanks for sharing your ideas, everyone, but this is the right meaning. Perhaps well done, Jimmy, you got the right meaning. And of course, in the diversity, if we're looking at a parable of Jesus, there's lots of different ideas about meaning and that text. And the move to a worldviews approach, perhaps a more scholarly encounter with texts, invites richer thinking, richer reasoning, and richer conversations. Instead of a narrow encounter where pupils are pretty much directed to a single interpretation, we might invite pupils in small groups to engage evaluatively in a range of statements about meaning and a text, where pupils have the opportunity to present their views, to listen carefully to one another, to build upon each other's arguments, perhaps linking them together or even physically showing they're building them by their fists going one on top of another, building to X's point. And they can arrive at their own view of meaning and this text, not necessarily a consensus. So what does oracy look like in the primary classroom? Well, I think it can look like many different things as it takes shape in certain contexts, and I always like to think about meaningful and manageable ways. But I think there are some shared principles that great cracking oracy ideas can constellate around. Firstly, I think it's best when it's intentional. And linking back to what Rachel was saying, that kind of whole school intention in building that whole school culture. And I think that culture is really important, establishing a culture for talk, recognizing that that doesn't just happen by chance. It requires the creation of a classroom culture which is established through relationships, through teacher modelling, and that includes the teacher presenting some undeveloped ideas and making mistakes, through establishing some class rules for talk. I think they're always best where they're created with pupils and are positively framed. Perhaps positioning the teacher as a co-facilitator in exploring some open inquiry questions. I think again, it recognises pupils as agents that have a voice. How can we invite people voices and welcome them to help them feel that their voice matters and it's heard? And having the courage and repertoire to employ slower, more open pedagogies that help pupils to engage in student-led self-governing dialogue rather than always feeling we need to control the dialogue in back and forth interactions. And thirdly, I think providing some really rich subject-specific activities that provide opportunities for reasoning via talk. This could be presentational, where we invite pupils to create a short podcast on how different Christians remember or celebrate Easter for a particular audience. Or maybe exploratory. I wonder, here are 2 or 3 different artworks on Jesus' baptism created by Christians from different times and places. What do you think about these artworks? Which of these do you think resonates the most with the biblical text we've just looked at? And why? Could you justify your views with others? And linking back to what Azaan had mentioned, cracking questions are the way into some awesome oracy. If a question we're using is, which one of these is not a member of the Trinity, God as Father, Son, Holy Spirit, or Spider-Man, it's unlikely to open up that rich dialogue. But an open question such as, what should we think about the parable of the Good Samaritan, can invite encounters with diverse ideas, diverse views from within and outside the classroom, helping pupils to engage with these ideas critically. What are the salient points, but also what are the aspects we could question? And helping pupils to listen, build upon ideas as they enter into some amazing scholarly conversations around religion and belief in the classroom. I think that's my 8 minutes. So thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Ryan. I was taken with what you were describing as dialogic learning, inviting pupils to reason across and through. And when you then went on to talk about I liked when we had this. I wanted to start singing, but that was an entirely different song. Yes, if you know it, it'd work, but I'm not going to start singing. But you were also talking about listening, and the importance, and possibly others have mentioned that too. But I think particularly in primary, well, I'm sure in secondary too, the skill of listening, and it took me back to one of Rachel's first points. When you were talking about understanding different meanings as well. And Rachel talked very much at the beginning about polarization. And by using oracy to show these different meanings and to accept these different meanings, then we are working against polarization. So thank you very much for that, Ryan. Will, last but not least, what you've heard so far, is this chiming with you? Have they stolen all the best bits? Have they left you anything to say? Do you agree with what they've said so far? What have you got to add? And in your experience, what do good RE and good oracy look like in the classroom?
Well, thanks very much indeed, Fiona, for inviting me. Good evening, everyone. Yes, I think Ryan, Rachel, and Azaan have definitely stolen a lot of points I would have loved to have made. Not so eloquently, I don't think. But yes, I think RE is such a powerful and thoughtful force. It needs to be protected, and I think I mean I really welcome the emphasis on RE coming up. And I imagine a lot of the people who are joining us here this evening are thinking, how on earth do we get oracy going? What are the practical things that we can do? You've got questions about progression. What would that mean in oracy? There's a lot of questions, and again, with a lot of the training I do in schools, it's great to hear these questions being aired and shared. So in this session, given that Ryan, Rachel, and Azaan have been given a lovely kind of landscape view of the importance of oracy and why it matters, I think I'm going to keep my 8 minutes pretty practical so that people have got things, little experiments to take away. I think my first idea or thought I want to share is the idea of inner oracy. What I mean by that is oracy we think of as speaking with other people. But of course we have, or a lot of us have, a voice in the head, the subvocal locutor, as it's sometimes called. And Lev Vygotsky, I think he was a Russian psychologist, he came up with this idea of, the chat out there, the discussion we're having becomes a discussion in here and enriches my thinking and my thoughts about my beliefs and my values and meaningfulness, my identity. And when that's enriched, next time I speak with other people, that gets shared and that swings back to me, that gets enriched again. So this is this amazing dynamic in two types of oracy, the oracy out there and the oracy in here. And in terms of being practical, then, there's a first suggestion is if you don't know about philosophy for children already, definitely have a look at it. There's loads of stuff online, but it's a fantastic pedagogy. I'm completely biased. I've been involved with it for about 30 years. But anecdotally, for secondary colleagues, first of all, I was a head of RE. I would do 1 in 5, 1 in 6 of my lessons in the philosophy for children way. This is an inquiry kind of led kind of lesson. And I did it at A level. I would say 1 in 7 lessons would be, and you think, God, this is precious time. I've got to cover the content. Well, I didn't want my students to just know stuff. I wanted them to understand stuff. And I think Oracy was a great way of doing that. And I don't think it's any mystery why, when you run lessons like that allows students to have a voice. I had a third of the sixth form. It was 80 students doing the full A level. And I think they voted with their feet because they loved that live discussion. That said, that's the secondary. I think primary, very important too. There are some fantastic dialogues that can happen at primary. Here are just a few ideas then, I want to put into the mix some practical things to try. The first suggestion is do go to my website. That is thinkingeducation.co.uk. There's lots of free resources on there. There's some about progression. How would you measure progression in a dialogue? How can you listen to a dialogue and look for creative, critical, collaborative and caring thinking in it? And you can score students. You could maybe get a teaching assistant to help with that. There's also the good reasoning tree, which is, I've used it for years, but it was only in recent years that I actually sort of got it designed. Let me just share what that is.
Will's giving you a little secret look at what's going to be our resource spotlight tomorrow. Excellent.
You're having heads up. Basically, it's like this. You put the proposition, so that might be the verification principle is correct, or God doesn't exist, or I don't know, whatever kind of proposition you want, a statement of some sort. You look at the reasons against it. That is, it's trying to blow the tree down, so that the proposition, if you like, is standing upright as a tree. The winds are trying to blow the proposition down. So these are reasons against the proposition. Then you consider the reasons for. That is, that's trying to hold the proposition up. It's backing the proposition. And then the pupils and the students can weigh up the winds and the roots that balance them. And then they conclude, do they think the tree, having thought it through, is standing upright? That is, they agree with the proposition. The roots were stronger than the wind. Did they find actually the tree was blown down because the reasons against were far stronger than the reasons for? That is, they disagree with the proposition and can say why. Or did they find it was a kind of a balanced argument that the tree was kind of bending over? So they conclude, and then the fruits of the tree are the consequences of my conclusions. So what? Now that I've concluded that, what might we do, or what might we think of next? Now, immediately you might be thinking of secondary context for this, RS GCSE papers. For Hindus, the most important aim of life is moksha. That might be the proposition. They go through the winds and the roots, decide what happens to the tree, and then think of the apples or the consequences. A levels, those 40-point questions. So anonymous Christians can also receive salvation. Discuss. Well, there's your proposition. There is an advanced version which adds some elements. So contexts are the clouds. This is like the circumstances, the context of the proposition. So they've got to define their terms, be clear about things. And then reasons against and for, they've got to not only give a reason against, but they've got to back it up with some evidence, some data, some quotes, some examples, whether they're from Holy Scriptures or whatever they are. They've got to back the reason up. And that is to take them into the realm of understanding that reasons differ in strength, not just in number. When I was a lecturer at university, even students there didn't get or hadn't been introduced to this idea that reasons differ in strength. So they can even score the reason, the strength of reason, weigh them up, conclude, etc. So there's just a couple of possible things, resources that you might find useful on my website. I think the final thing, if I have a moment or two, is just that it's been a theme so far about dialogue and debate. I think both are very useful. To get them into dialogue, that is listening and building and collaboratively thinking, I might just use some Lego blocks, and you can use this with adults in staff rooms. Don't think of this as primary because it's Lego. Maybe just give them 3 Lego blocks each. This is how many times they can contribute to the discussion. So it puts a lid on the more vocal characters, shall we say. And it puts into the hands of the quieter ones that are sort of physical representation of I am included in this. So let's say they're talking about, let's keep it very broad and simple. Let's say they're talking about, I don't know, bullying. And they say, child says, I think bullies are bad. That contribution would go into the center of the room. The next child to speak must show that I listened to that contribution and my contribution will connect with it. So I've got to listen and link. So I can't just stack what I want to think, what I want to say in my head and ignore everyone else and wait for my turn. I listen to it and link, and that might be agreeing with it, disagreeing with it, giving an example, a counterexample, asking a question about that first contribution, but they have to listen and link and so on. So they literally watch themselves construct a line of inquiry. And that is where you get your forward learning movement in a dialogue as opposed to mere Q&A in a conversation. So thinkingeducation.co.uk, they're free resources. You don't have to register. There's no emails or whatever. You just ping on it and you'll get it. Fiona, that's my minute.
Thank you very much, Will. I love how our conversation has really unpacked what we need to think about as far as what Oracy is as a whole, and then very particularly within RE, before we have gone into what we might do in the classroom. And I'm glad we've got to what we might do in the classroom, but it needs to be built on those first sets of thinking. And anything that finishes off with Lego blocks is obviously a positive. So we have an opportunity for you to add your questions. You've clearly been hanging on everybody's words because none that are unanswered are there yet. Will's Good Reasoning Tree is our free resource in the resource spotlight tomorrow, but the link to his website is there, but we've got some stuff from him in our resource spotlight. But while you're thinking about your questions, I'm going to ask our speakers, has anyone got anything they want to come back, comment, or ask a question? We might not have time for all of you to do that, but just sort of interrupt while I wait for everyone else's questions, or we can just have a nice chat amongst ourselves. Rachel, Azaan, Rachel.
Yeah, I just literally been shouting at the screen. Thankfully, I was muted, but that was just beautiful. I think, like you say, Fiona, it was just a beautifully curated conversation without us realising it. I think listening to everybody, the one thing that I would like to reiterate is the art of deeply listening. I think Will's example there, with Finding My Voice, we talk about the stage of collaboration before you go deep into exploratory talk. The understanding of how you build and grow a conversation is really key. And adults don't do it very well either. We wait for our turn to speak, to actually clear your mind and properly listen. And then, Will, when you talked about the Gotsky and, you know, that external, internal, it's so important that we consider and help our colleagues to understand the process that's going on that we can't see in our young people's heads. One comes from what they hear and what they're processing as in a space of discipline. So think about what that means for RE and how powerful that is. But the other element comes from when they're actually then articulating their thoughts, and they're coming out, and sometimes they don't even know what's coming out of their mouth. It comes from deep within them, and then they're surprised themselves, and it really is a beautiful thing. So sorry, excited Oracy fan here. So yeah, that was my thoughts.
Thank you, Rachel. I think the importance of listening, the importance of listening and not just waiting to have your turn to speak. I think, as you say, adults, we can be rubbish at that. We're just waiting for our moment to say something, and we are not taking in what everyone else is saying, which is why I quite liked the building blocks as well. Azaan.
Yeah, I think I just want to also jump on that point around listening, and it's a really important one, because one of the things I often say to my students is, are you listening to prepare a response, or are you listening because you're taking it in or drinking it in? And I think even as adults, we're conscious of this in general conversation. You're listening to a person speak, and in your head at the same time, you're preparing what you're going to say in response. But actually taking that moment to, like you say, active listening or mindfully listening, I think is really important. So I often do like these fishbowl discussions where I have half the class inside the fishbowl, half the class outside of it. And I get students to, on the outside, to listen carefully and write down what they've learned and reflected on, just so that they're practicing the very, I suppose, art of listening. Because it can be a real challenge, getting us out of the habit of listening just so we can say something back rather than taking it in.
And also finding ways to allow pupils to note their thoughts down. So going back to primary, this idea of I think probably we did think pair share before even it happened in secondary. But I think when you do, I think pair share is a great strategy. But I sometimes think, where do we get, how are we helping the children to remember the thing they did when they were thinking, because they might have listened to the other person talking and they've forgotten everything that they've said. So have we got structures, whether it's sentence starters, whether it's ways of noting things, just to help people, that those kind of structures around what we are doing, and fishbowl was a lovely example there, Azaan. Okay, I have some questions come through. Oh, so there's some great comments in here. Kelly, one of our blog writers, says, good oracy can obviously help students develop their written work, but there's a huge emphasis on writing when it comes to how we examine. Would you like to see more emphasis on oracy within examinations? Who wants to answer that one?
At the risk of speaking too much, I saw that question. I thought I definitely would love to jump in there. I think, I mentioned this point about there's obviously a real focus on improving our writing. And I think, we can see that there's real evidence of how oracy can really improve writing. And at the moment, I'm currently doing research on this particular area, where I've been kind of setting out these oracy activities where I basically set students on a path where they do the regular lessons, they do a 12-mark question at the end of it, and then I set them on another path of 6 lessons. But all 6 lessons, I have some sort of oracy activity in there. And then I've compared what the outcome is in their quality of their answers. And one of the things that I found in the research is that just the quality of their writing just improves just from doing that oracy. So if we make time in our lessons, Will talked about that ratio of 1 philosophy for children lesson out of 7, for example. If we really make the time to input those oracy activities, the benefits of that will reflect in our ability to write, in their ability to write. But I do also think, there's also a question about, having more oracy-based examinations potentially. But I suppose that conversation might be a long way away.
Thanks, Azaan. I like what you've put in the chat there about not all children can speak, but actually what sits underneath oracy is available. It is about communication and the different ways we might do that, and the thinking that leads to that communication. I think that's a really important point you put there. This may well be our final question from Alexis, who thanks you all, and wishes we were here for much longer. How can we include the less vocal children in thinking together? Crikey, Will, your hand went up fast. That must be for you then.
It's a fantastic question, and we could spend a morning on exploring this. But I think one of the few key questions that immediately come to mind is, why are they less vocal? Often we think of that child as quiet, but maybe the dynamic, what we would call caring thinking in the classroom, is not welcoming. I often find this, and I don't know why, but it's particularly, I think, girls have a lot of great stuff to say, but there can be some very loud boys prone to premature articulation. And it's an old chestnut, but I insist on using it. It's in that situation, I think you've got to question, is it the child who's being quiet and they're thinking, or are they quiet and away with the fairies? And in which case you need to check in with them. Are there ways of sort of pulling the louder voices back? So just as a practical suggestion, get some playing cards from your local pound stretcher, hand them out, but just be a little bit canny. Maybe you'd hand all the club cards to all the ones who speak a little bit more than others. And then you hand the others, the hearts, the spades and the diamonds, to the others. And then you just might happen to ask for the club cards less, so that you're creating a bit more of a space for those other voices to come through. Also have pauses and get them to write ideas down and let them build their confidence. I'm not in the P4C tradition, we're not of the, pick a lolly stick out with their name and ask them, what do you think? In philosophy for children, it's always voluntary contribution only. And that is because, one, they have something to say, they might not, but they have something to say and they want to share it. We wait for that point of confidence. And often that when they speak, it's a brilliant contribution. Maybe for the first time they've spoken in front of the whole class, it's when the hair can go up on the back of your neck and you just bristle with excitement. You're thinking, this is a big moment. And often it's a top quality thought. It's about checking the dynamic and getting the caring thinking going, not just thinking that child's a quiet child. There's a lot more to be said. It's a great question, Alexis, and I'm sorry I haven't got more time to say something.
Thank you very much. And Rachel, I really like what you've put in there. Some of us who are vocal people have to remember to think, when should I say nothing at all? I believe there's a song about that. But I think that was a very wise thing the child in your group said at that point, Rachel, and something that we're perhaps, again, as adults, some of us aren't quite as good at.
Yeah. Could I just 1 second, because I think this builds on what Will said, actually, is that really this is powerful personal development, right? So that quiet child should never have that label quiet child. I understand why we use that term, but this is an opportunity, in the same way as I'm talking about the ADHD response, is that I'm understanding who I am as a communicator, and as us as practitioners need to deeply understand where our young people are, and this is an opportunity to shape them as humans. And so for every child it's something slightly different, and I think that's where we need to learn to really flex within set models.
Thank you, Rachel. A lovely point to end on. Thank you to all our speakers, to Rachel, to Azaan, to Ryan, to Will, to all the people who are contributing to our Oracy Focus Week. Do we need to talk more? It seems it's not a simple answer to that question at all. So thank you to all of you as well for coming along. And we'd really like to hear from you. Let us know what you think about this session on social media. We're on, it seems all the channels, but definitely Blue Sky, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook. I think we might be on Instagram as well. I'm not good at that one. Or contact us. I'm Fiona at cstg.org.uk. About the strategies you're using, about some of your thoughts about how you're developing things in your school, in your department. I hope you found today's session useful. There will be more focus weeks coming along next term. Thank you to our speakers and thank you to all of you. Have a lovely evening.